I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Whadjuk Noongar peoples, and extend our acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the land in which people from across the state and Australia are attending. And I would like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So before we get going, just a little bit of housekeeping. We'd love to hear your questions, so I strongly encourage you to please send them through the Q&A function, and we'll go through them at the end of the presentation. If you have more than one person listening in the room today, can you please send us a quick private message in the chat tab just to let us know how many people are attending. And also, once the webinar is finished, there will be a survey that pops open when you close the webinar, when you close the Zoom function. So if everyone can please take a few moments to complete this and provide feedback. So a little bit about Injury Matters. We are for safer people and places. Injury Matters aims to prevent and reduce the impact of injury within the West Australian community. We do this through advocating and providing education for injury prevention, as well as providing support for those who have been impacted by injury. So today's webinar is brought to you through our No Injury program with the support of the Department of Health WA. So No Injury is a statewide program which aims to enhance the capacity of injury prevention and safety promotion practitioners and organisations such as yourself to deliver quality injury prevention activities. So No Injury provides training, resources and networking opportunities. So a little bit of an overview of today's presentation. So for us, climate change, including extreme weather events, is an emerging area for injury prevention in Australia. With the accelerating frequency and intensity of extreme weather events in Australia, we are seeing the impact on human health and well-being. Among these impacts are injuries. Whilst the causes of climate change is more of a global issue, the health impacts are local and they are occurring in our communities where people live, work and play. For the injury prevention and safety promotion sector, we can all have a role to play in reducing the impact of extreme weather events and the burden of injury in Australia. So today, Dr. Liz Hanna will be providing a broad overview of climate change and injury prevention, including looking at what's currently happening in the space, some of the short and long-term mitigation strategies to reduce the impact of climate change and injury, as well as looking at some of the resources available for support. So I'd now like to introduce you to Dr. Liz Hanna. So Liz Hanna chairs the Environmental Health Working Group of the World Federation of Public Health Associations. Prior to that, she was the president of the Climate and Health Alliance for 6 years until 2017. Late in 2008, she joined the Australian National University to convene Australia's National Climate Change Adaptation Research Network for Human Health. As a recipient of multiple awards for her research and advocacy on climate change impacts on human health, she is contracted by governments here in Australia and across the Pacific to design and conduct climate change vulnerability assessments and present dozens of keynote addresses at international and national conferences. Under a regime of accelerating climate change, Liz is adamant that everyone become informed of the impending climate threats to their region so they can prepare, adapt and mitigate risks to themselves and their families and their communities. So I'd now like to pass you over to Dr. Liz Hanna. If you want to share your screen and take it from me, Liz.
Yes, doing that, doing that now.
Great, thank you.
Pulling it down so I can start my slideshow. I've got to get it before the little thing comes down. Slideshow from the beginning. Okay. And firstly, I'd like to let you know that I'm talking to you today from Ngunnawal country, which is over here in the ACT. And I acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, as well as those over where most of you are sitting. And also mention that with this as I've been introduced with the World Federation of Public Health Associations, and congratulate Taryn and Western Australia, because Taryn has just been voted the new incoming president for Australia's Public Health Association. And I know that he was leading on your climate change, the Western Australian climate change inquiry. So that's wonderful to have close involvement in the national public health arena coming from the West, because we understand, of course, that distance is very isolating. So well done, Taryn, and well done, Western Australia, and we look forward to working more closely with him as well. Okay, so moving on, I'm just getting sure that, okay. So what I thought we'd run through quickly today is, I'll just get rid of, I've got a little sign up here, which is irritating for me. Right, okay, so that's not on this one. There it is, got it. Just briefly give you an update of the current climate situation that's happening globally and Australia, and some of the projections, what we can look forward to, specifically in the West as well as Australia. The relationship between climate and how climate actually translates into injury and potential for injury. And if we're wanting to intervene in that process, just running through a little bit about the pathways at how climate disruption can actually harm human health, and the general risks. And with this, of course, injuries, I take a broad definition of injuries, because some of this, of course, will involve a lot of mental health issues as well as physical injuries. And one of the key things, of course, if we're wanting to minimize harm and prevent harm, then a lot of that gets back into health protection and adaptation responses, which is, you know, policies and responsibilities and community self-protection. And what we do find, of course, is that there's a great relationship, of course, between policies and responsibilities. And these also carry forward to community self-protection. And of course, therefore, there's a strong relationship between policies and how we actually help the community look after itself. But it also goes backwards. So the responsibilities, of course, there's responsibilities for as to who's going to be setting the policies and how they reflect and improve the health of the population. And of course, you know, the community responsibility in driving this forward as well. So basically the policies and responsibility, who's got responsibility for what, and community self-protection, that's actually all interrelated. And so that theme of the interrelatedness of all this will be carrying through. And I've got a tickle in my throat, so I'll have a glass of water. Got him. Okay, good. So briefly, what's been happening, and I'll work through this part actually quite quickly, so we can get to the more, you know, the more relevant parts. But it's important to note the fact that warming has been accelerating. This slide goes back to 1860 up to 2020, and you can see the rapid rise in climate. Globally, 2019 was nearly a whole degree, over half a degree warmer than the 1981 average, which of course is a good deal warmer than the pre-industrial time. And so the world has already warmed, and it depends on, you know, which area and what the latest input is, but it's well over a degree that we've already warmed. So as far as this year is concerned, it's rollicking ahead. So the latest data from January to September for 2020 is that it's a 99% chance that this year will be either the world's hottest or second hottest. We've got a few months to go, but if it crosses this line, and this is the previous hottest year, which was 2016, this black line is this year. If that crosses, then this will be yet another world hottest year. The thing is, if we could limit average global warming to 1.5 degrees rather than the 2 degrees, which was the Paris Agreement, we could protect 420 million people from being exposed to severe heat waves. So, I mean, this is why we keep saying that it's really worthwhile doing everything we can to put the halt on warming. And we can see here that this is the 1 degree warmer than the pre-industrial. And the World Meteorological Organization is sending out increasingly alarming messages saying that the world is the warming is accelerating. And so, of course, what has this done for even just last year or this current year's global climate? Well, you'd be well familiar, of course, with the national trauma that Australia suffered as those fires burnt over 45 million acres of bushland. You've heard quite a bit possibly about the recent Californian fires. The Australian fires were 12 times that size. And that's absolutely massive. It is on record, since records have been kept, the world's largest bushfire. And as you know, many farms, homes, businesses, lives lost, and well over 3 billion animals perished. The fires, of course, are happening almost every year now in Siberia. Siberia should not burn. The Arctic Circle should not be burning. There's also catastrophic flooding happening in France, China, Bangladesh, India. So all over the globe, there's climate mayhem. The hottest temperature ever recorded on Earth in Death Valley in the USA, that actually cracked over 54 degrees. In Antarctic, the temperature has risen over 20 degrees. We've seen the third mass coral bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef. And within the Arctic Circle, temperatures actually even cracked 38 degrees. So obviously it's melting very, very, very rapidly, and the poles are warming faster than everywhere else. So it's not only the atmosphere, the global, and we talk in terms of the average land and ocean temperatures. The ocean is, the sea level rise is also accelerating, as you can see by this graph goes back to 1995. This is problematic, but also rising is that because the ocean absorbs well over 90% of the atmospheric heat from our greenhouse gases, you dissolve the sea and it absorbs about 30% or more of the CO2, which makes the ocean more acidic, which is problematic because the exoskeletons, calcium carbonate, they dissolve in acid. So, and there's also ocean deoxygenation. So that combines to a massive decline in fish. So the world is very worried about the interruptions to the marine food web, and that well over 35% of the global population get pretty much all their animal protein from fish. So there's industries and human nature, human nutrition. So as far as this is happening in Australia, we know that last year was our hottest, and that was over 1.5 degrees hotter than normal. And you can see the very strident warming trend dating back to 1910. So far this year, the September in Australia was over 2.5 degrees warmer than the most recent 81 to 90 average. So as we said, warming is accelerating. And we're expecting that the 1.5 degree threshold is possibly going to be breached, that threshold, by as early as possibly 2024, which is very, very close. Some reports are indicating that the world is already 1.3, so we're rollicking ahead. Western Australia, your local turf, you've also had a very, very hot year last year. That was well over 1.5 degrees hotter than your average, again going back to 1910. And your heat records have been massive, and they're tumbling as well. And so it was exceptionally hot. This is Western Australia. This is all from the Bureau of Meteorology, of course, and the warming that's been experienced over yonder between 1970 and last year. And you can see which areas have been warming, the most strongest warming signal. And the colours here relate to the proportion of a degree warming that's been observed every 10 years. And that's really quite a lot. This year you've had a very dry year. And even though you've had very, very many dry years, you're still having regions in the southwest corner that have been the lowest on record. Good news, however, is that Western Australia, particularly the central and southeast areas, the Bureau has said in their most recent 3-month outlook that it's going to be a little bit cooler and a little bit wetter than average. So that's actually some good news. So with regard to projections, what's we're looking forward to in the near future? Perth in the long-term history, and then the Bureau talk in terms of 30-year records. Because of so much variability, you need a long time period to actually know exactly what the climate is doing. So back in the Bureau's main reference period, which is 1961 to 1990, Perth had about 20, on average, 27 days per year that were over 35. This had increased by the decade 2000 and 2009 up to 33. And that's not a full decade, but that was the last time I ran through these stats, and that had jumped again to 41. That's the observed from the Bureau records, days over 35, and these are the projections. And these RCPs are the representative concentration pathways, which are the IPCC projection models. So the midway, as in not the best case scenario, not the worst case scenario, but the middle of the road scenario, the modelling suggested that by 2030, Perth would be experiencing 36 days per year over 35. Well, this has already been busted. The modelling also suggested that by 2090, in the middle range projections, that you'd be getting 43, on average, 43 days per year over 35. And I would say that Perth has already busted the 2090 projections, and that was the middle of the road. And so there's a new tranche of projections that's coming out that's called CMIP 6, and that's amplifying the projections, because obviously these were far too cautious. So what does this mean for health? Basically climate change has made a variety of impacts on air pollution, changes in vector ecology, allergens, water quality impacts, water, food and supply. But most relevant to us here today is injuries, and that's extreme heat and severe weather. So this is where we'll be focusing from here. So what are Australia's key climate threats, and how does that translate? Well, heat. Heat is definitely Australia's major climate threat. Drought is another one, and fires and floods and storms and sea level rise. So I'll be going through each of these in a bit more detail. But what we do know is that all of these changes, all of these climate threats disrupt our environment, and they disrupt our activities of daily living. They interrupt with our life and our livelihoods. They can all create lethal hazards. They can all cause injuries. Where it's really problematic, of course, is when you get combined impacts, and they can cascade and they can evolve into natural disasters, which indeed our fires were last year. So kicking off first with heat. One of the reasons that heat is a really major issue for Australia is that our average temperature is 14 degrees hotter than the global average. So we are a hot country. So that, as the world is getting warmer, we're already ahead of the curve. So heat is a very high risk for us. So as far as people are concerned, there's the risk of heat stress, which translates into deaths and hospitalizations. And even people that don't die can have chronic health problems, because you can get organ damage if you really get hot and you stay very hot for a long period of time. Other issues with heat, of course, are the occupational exposures. That can translate to productivity loss. And of course, if people think they're not going to lose their income, it makes them stay and work a bit longer. And that can cause higher exposure levels, and of course, people becoming ill. Injuries, direct injuries happen a lot, and that certainly increases in the heat. And if you think of it just in terms of people have sweaty hands, when you are hot, and particularly when you're dehydrated, you get the double whammy. That actually translates into a cognitive impairment. You're not thinking as clearly. So if people aren't thinking as clearly, then they can make bad decisions, or you misjudge things. So particularly if you imagine people that are using heavy equipment, then they can just have more errors. And so you've got the risk of people having injuries from sweaty hands, not thinking as clearly as they otherwise would. And indeed, what happens when people are working near hot things or with hot equipment. Other problems, of course, other injuries that relate from heat, of course, is that as you know, when you have a temperature, a fever, you feel pretty yucky. And so your people's core temperature rises on a hot day when they can't dissipate all that extra heat, and they feel ordinary. They feel really bad. So there's increased rates, and this pattern's all over the world. There's increased rates of violence and conflict when people are hot, when the weather's hot. That translates to more injuries, more car accidents, domestic violence, workplace horizontal violence. People are just snippy, really, and they're just more argumentative, more likely to fly off the handle. So there's an increased level of injuries translating from all of that. And of course, if it's hot, there's a tendency, specifically in Australia, but also other places, where people are more inclined to drink, particularly beer, for the cooling effects, and that doesn't help at all. Other major areas, of course, for Australia is drought and water shortages, which we know relates to crop failures and destocking and financial loss and suicide, attempted suicide and injuries. And that's we've got a lot of very strong evidence of the relationship between drought in Australia and self-harm. And of course, as far as sporting is concerned, when that ground is hard, then we certainly notice an increase in injuries of people connecting with the ground. And it's a very strong relationship. Fires, of course, so you get increased heat, you get increased drought, and you get everything that you need for more fires. And of course, the injuries of that, the worst case scenario, of course, is death, but burns, smoke inhalation, car accidents, when people are trying to drive through smoke. They're in a hurry, they're trying to escape, and so you get an increase of more traffic on the road. Again, people are frightened and fearing, but particularly if they can't see in smoke. And of course, falling trees. So with fires, there's also a lot of loss of infrastructure, the usual crops, stock and wildlife, and again, the grief and anger that comes along with that. So, and I'll continue on more with the floods and storms later, but having just gone through those three, into what we're doing and how are we adapting, how are we trying to minimise this. So is Australia adapting to a hotter world? Well, you could think maybe not. New housing development. I took this photo flying into Canberra out the aeroplane window, and you can see all those black houses, black rooftops, big houses, and this pattern is happening all over Australia. It's in Darwin, it's in Hobart, it's in the West. New big housing developments, no space for trees, and black roofs. When you consider that houses are long-lived assets, these houses are going to be around for 60 years or so, right up to 2080, when we could be 4 degrees warmer. And of course, if there's no space for trees, then you don't get the cooling of trees. Why are we against black roofs? Well, this is a study, this is data from looking at the internal temperature of the house with a black roof, a white roof, a green roof, and the blue line is the air temperature. And the black roofs are, 30 degrees or more hotter than the others. I did some of my heat research I did with around Australia, and this is with people working in the heat and how that would translate to harm. And the people who are working in the industries are putting in the pink bats, particularly up in Queensland. They start about 5 o'clock in the morning. They have to be out of a black roof by about 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning because it's too hot to be in there. And then they move to the white roofs. And then after about 10 o'clock, they then do the insulation around the outside of the house. And that's, they live and breathe this. But the thing is, if Australia is serious about trying to stop people dying in their homes because of heat, then we really need to think and stop people putting on black roofs. It's a very simple strategy to stop. And so how did Australia go last year with heat? That's an ugly, ugly map of Australia, you'll agree. This is, again, from the Bureau. This ugly, deep brown colour, parts of Australia that exceeded 48 degrees. The chucky brown colour is over 37. This coffee colour is temperatures, part of the landscape that was over 46. And that's seriously problematic. In last summer, the continental average temperature all across Australia reached 42, a new record. We had 11 days where the national average was over 40. Now, to put this into context, Australia had only had 11 days in its entire history, or meteorological history, that we've had the records since 1910. So we'd only had 11 days until last summer, and we had 11 days last summer. And of those 11 days in the historical record, 7 of those were the previous summer. So again, this illustrates the fact that we are warming rapidly, and heat is a very major issue that we're going to have to contend with. And we're going to have to work out how we work with heat in our work life, in our sporting life, commuting, and going about our daily lives. And it's a huge conversation that Australia needs to have, because it will have ramifications for transport options, walking, bus stops, shade, everything we do, times we work in the day. And as you can see by this lighter area, which is just temperatures under 40 degrees, which is why climate scientists are moving in droves to Tasmania. Okay, so rainfall. Not only is Australia the hottest, one of the hottest, it's also the world's most extreme variation in rainfall. So, and we know the land of droughts and flooding rains. That's very, very, very true. This is Australia's coefficient of variability, much more than Africa, India, Canada, and other places. And of course, we know we're having droughts, we know we're getting drier. The regions that are getting drier are these areas, which is a big concern, because this is where most Australians live, and it's where we do most of our agriculture. So this is going to have other ramifications. And again, as I said, you get dry lands, and you get more fires, and you get more injuries on the ground. Droughts also flowing into the rainfall flowing into Perth dams. You'll be so familiar with this, no doubt. And the stepwise decline that you've had. The first major decline was around 75, and then another one around 2000. You've had some wet years since, but of course this precipitated your bores, your backyard bores, and of course desal plants. And again, if you're thinking of what people need to access water, people are going to do all manner of things to access water. And if those things, it's not as easy as just turning on a tap, it's another area where, as climate change is progressing, there is more avenues that we haven't always thought about that can actually translate to harm and injury. Not only the diseases, but what people are trying to do to avoid disease. Fires. Well, from an injury perspective, anyone with an injury mindset can see the risk of injury coming from this. Not only that, but these people are standing on the back of a truck, and how that translates. This was before I moved into climate change research. This was what my life looked like. I was an intensive care nurse, and I used to be in charge of this unit, which is the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne's intensive care unit. And so we had the big burns unit, and so we looked after a lot of burns, and I can tell you burns injuries are truly, truly horrible. And these fires are so bad that we tend to have more injuries and more deaths and very few injuries, because the fires are so intense, and they're not survivable. What this insert here is a close-up of this area, and this is a patient with, I'd say, full thickness burns on their head. They've also inhalation burns, because that's the tube going into their lungs from the ventilator. They will have their hands will be burnt because people try to protect their head. This will be long-term injuries, long-term hospitalization with facial scarring. They often end up addicted to the opiates because it's very painful, and it's and disfigurement, because if their hands are burnt, your plastic surgery skin doesn't bend as well as natural skin, so their mobility is limited. They're going to be scarred. They're truly shocking injuries, burns. And fires are increasing our risk of this. The recent fires, what we can see here is down in the south coast of New South Wales and around the Merimbula in Victoria. It was holiday season. The fires came down and forced people to the beach and fleeing. And again, people are leaving in a hurry, grabbing a few things. They didn't realise they're going to be there for days and days and days. They also bring their pets, which is understandable. Now, again, if you're thinking of communities and what's going to happen when they face a fire, you don't automatically think of an extra injury risk when people are trying to gather up their pets to evacuate their pets as well. Natural, normal thing to do. During floods in Queensland and other places where we've had a massive climatic disruption and people have been evacuated, in the early years, people were not allowed to bring their pets because the evacuation centres couldn't accommodate pets. Well, the mental health grief was just astronomical. So they very soon, there was wailing and gnashing of teeth because people couldn't bear the thought that their pet was either burning or drowning or stuck and hungry and all the rest of it. And so they now try to accommodate people to bring their pets, but of course this is this is injuries waiting to happen. And it's another area of, if you're wanting to educate people into how they're going to prepare and how we're going to help people prepare to prevent injuries when these extreme weather events happen. We really need to look outside the box in terms of unexpected sources of injury. Yes, so as I said, the roads, the fires were so thick and so large that the roads across the southeast corner of Australia were blocked with all the fallen trees. The fires, and of course this is a worst case scenario, the fires occurred during peak holiday season, so the policymakers weren't at their desks. People were away from home. They didn't have their normal support systems, and you just grab a suitcase and you go on holidays. And so you had sort of dislocated people in a foreign place, foreign as in non-usual. And as far as trying to get the organised response, when half the agencies were on their summer holiday, because it was over New Year was one of these worst ones. And so the little towns had influx of thousands of extra tourists. So all the shops ran out of food, they ran out of water, there was no fuel, the local hospitals were overrun, the communication towers burnt down. So there was no radio, no internet, no phones, no roads, and no help. So the community had to support themselves. And again, this is another really key message in terms of how we're going to prepare communities and to help them help themselves. Really has to factor in the fact that when natural disasters happen, they have to be prepared and to know how to respond. That was one of the most telling lessons. The toll of those fires, I won't go into great detail here, you can find out those, but again, it's absolutely massive, an area larger than Syria. Over 5.1 million Australians were affected by smoke. Nearly 2 million missed work. And so the early estimates, this was published in January, early estimates were $1.3 billion in lost economic production only if these Australians missed one day of work. We know it's a lot more. There were many deaths. Sadly, many of those were fighting fires. Even a fire truck, a fully laden water truck, flipped in a fire tornado. It just shows the strength of the uplift of the winds, and all crew died at that time. Smoke, there were 445 deaths around the fire that was smoke related. And of course, this was something that we, hadn't actually prepared for. You think fires and you think burns, but the fact that many, many, many more people were affected by smoke with asthma, respiratory diseases, and even people that didn't have known respiratory problems came into grief, because, as you can see, the smoke was so thick. So the health cost, again, these are early estimates of $2 billion. We know all up that it's well over $10 billion was the cost of those fires. And the toll will continue. And of course, then there's also, the total loss of the environmental amenity, and the grief and the mental health problems, but also the interruptions to tourism. Okay, so going back to where we were is the floods, storms and oceans. Okay, so we'll start drilling down into some of those. Injuries that can happen from floods. Some of the key ones are contamination of water sources, as floods will pick up all the, the chemicals, oil, and you see a lot of photographs of oil slicks on floodwaters. People have to wade through that. They get infections in their cuts and skin lesions. There's drownings is something that we think a lot through, and I'll go through that a bit more in a moment. And people driving through high waters. Storms also, rain, flooding, very high winds and injuries from flying debris, and damaged infrastructure. Also, of course, the live electricity wires and, sort of people not being aware of how dangerous that can be, and trip hazards, as well as oceans and sea level rise. And again, the most significant of these, of course, being the concurrent and cascading and secondary events that follow. And I mentioned the blackouts, so you're trying to respond, but you've got no power, you've got no communications, you've got no roads, you've run out of fuel, and so on. Some of Australia's biggest floods were the two sequential La Ninas, back around 2011, in Queensland, where an area as large as France and Germany combined was inundated. And the average global sea level dropped. It was discernible from satellite imagery and global tide marks, because Australia is so flat, so much water landed on Australia, and it took 6 months to flow off because we don't have much fall. And when I'm at international conferences telling people that we had some major floods, and at the Murray Mouth, they had 6 months warning that a flood water was coming. Overseas people can't imagine that you can get 6 months warning of flood coming down. But such is the size of Australia, and the fact that we're flat with very little gradient and very slow flow. But again, the injuries, it's pretty easy to spot the likelihood of injuries with flooding and water over road. It's a very common sight. But there's diverse risks. This is when the Ivanhoe Dam overflowed, and that's they described a tsunami of water went through the streets, and you can see it's halfway up the telephone poles. Anyone in that would have been swept away. But there's other injuries and risks that people don't think about, and it's not only us trying to flee floods, but wildlife try to flee floods as well. And I had friends in a flood in Victoria, and the next day they tried to wade through to see if there was anything down at the end of their property, and there was a raft of floating spiders. Now, if she'd gone through at night time, those spiders would have tried to get purchase on a dry piece, which meant they would have run up her leg. So that we think of floods, there are things we think about, but there's all manner of different injuries. And if people are trying to protect their pets, their pets are scrambling, because they're frightened and terrified. So there's scratches and other injuries. So again, when thinking of injuries that can come from climate mayhem, really need to think very, very broadly at the sort of things that you're likely to encounter. Here's a study. It'd be nice to repeat this with a larger larger database and more recent database. This was published in 2010 in the Australia's Emergency Medicine Australasia. It was a study looking at flood deaths. So they started getting all the data they could about flood-related deaths, and only the acute deaths, the short-term deaths that happened at the time, rather than mid-term and long-term deaths. If the death was indirect, they excluded it from the study. That narrowed it down to 68 known deaths out of a total of 38. Of those, none of those deaths were related to trauma. They were all drownings. That in itself is really telling. So then they investigated how many of those drownings were people who were trapped and how many who were untrapped. And only 1.5% of those deaths were trapped. And that's trapped in an open area, like a cave or in an isolated area. Nobody was trapped in a building. So 98.5% of the drownings were people who were not trapped. Over 16% drowned by crossing a waterway, either by wading or swimming, and underestimating the force of flowing water. Over a quarter, 26.5%, drowned doing stupid things, inappropriate behaviour, swimming or surfing in floodwaters. Half the deaths were vehicle related. 40% of the deaths were people trying to cross a waterway in their vehicle, again, underestimating, because you only need about 6 inches of water to push your car off a road, crossing a waterway in a car, and 8.8% drowned when the road collapsed underneath them. 4.4% of the deaths were boat related, and nearly 3% were attempting rescue. So it really highlights the significance of the fact that drownings mostly happen when people were not trapped. Many were doing silly things, or indeed underestimating the force. This highlights, scope for education to save a lot of lives if we get the message out of how dangerous floods can be, because we will see more floods. And clearly people seem to think, particularly now that everyone seems to own a four-wheel drive, that I've got a four-wheel drive and that'll get me through. It doesn't. It doesn't. So it's a real issue that we need to educate. Really simple message we can do. Sea level rise, rising rapidly and accelerating. And of course, this is going to be very, very costly, but of course it can cause damage to homes, businesses, families, livelihoods and communities. Pop this one up just as a matter of interest, and that's if the Antarctic ice sheet melt and sea levels would rise another 55 metres. That'll take a few hundred years. We're not in danger of Australia looking like this yet. But the thing is, because we know sea level rise is happening and accelerating, the low-lying areas will be inundated more and more frequently. And so there's a lot in the scientific literature of planned retreat, moving people back from the coastline, particularly in low-lying areas. And I'm not sure how many of you are aware that that Indonesia is relocating the city of Jakarta. This is 10 million people, because some of Indonesia is now, because it's sinking a bit, is now underneath the sea level, and that's having too many floods. So they're moving the capital of Indonesia across to the island of Borneo, near Kalimantan. And so there's more and more of this, because you know that a lot of airports are by the sea, a lot of very expensive real estate is by the sea, and so there'll be more and more risk of injuries with the big tidal surges. So the IPCC talks in terms of protecting people and resilience, but they seem to think in terms of socioeconomic. So they describe socioeconomic resilience as the capability to prevent or cope with the impacts, i.e. reduce harm. And it includes all the technical, institutional, economic and cultural capacity. And they basically argue that if we increase this resilience, then we're reducing the risks of the impact on society. Well, that's fine, but we tend to look at it with a health and injuries lens. And so redefining resilience is the capability of a society when we're thinking of climate change coming and accelerating further, that it's the capability of a society to be able to prevent injuries and to limit the loss of life and well-being and to cope with the impacts of climate change, including sea level rise. And we need to do this by protecting the fundamental determinants of health, which is a safe environment and securing, food, water, housing, infrastructure, and livelihoods. And we need to start off by having a very healthy health status, because people are much better able at compensating if they start from a healthy baseline. And so we need to also boost the national capacity, which is why it's terrific that you're interested in this topic, and to be able to respond to what the needs might be. And so we need to boost the nation's capacity to protect health. And most of this happens through education and preparation so that the community is in better position to be able to bounce back. We'd also argue that we, particularly those of us coming from the health background and health and protection and injury harm minimisation, use our voice to help demand urgent, strong mitigation to limit greenhouse gases, because we're literally fighting for human protection and human survival. Cannot stress that enough. So as far as adaptation, what we're looking at against extreme weather, we need preparedness. We need to prepare the community, plus also the workforce, which includes the first responders and, of course, the recovery teams. And the aim is to have a resilient community. And so both the community, the workforce, and everyone needs to understand what are the health risks, the climate health risks that are going to happen in my part of the world. What's the pathway that a climate interruption, mayhem, extreme weather is going to actually cause me harm? Me, my community, the people I need to look after. You need to understand, of course, who's more vulnerable and why they're more vulnerable, and to initiate strategies and this health protective policy. And of course, as always, evaluate to work out what's working best, and education and this whole cyclic thing of making it better and improving. So, okay, number one, we know heat waves, they're going to soar. They're already soaring, they're going to continue soaring. So heat is something that everyone needs to prepare for. And so I'm going to run through a few of these to just looking at heat, and that can translate to all the others, is that to protect it, we need to have a deep understanding of the risks, the nature of the risk, the setting that it's going to happen in, and the pathway. So understanding how sort of heat is going to affect people at work, at home, doing whatever they do, recreation, sport, doing what activities, what are going to be the exposures, how are they going to be vulnerable, and you need that knowledge to be able to prevent harm, to optimize resilience and capacity. Now with heat, we know that cardiorespiratory fitness is protective, obesity is not. And acclimatization regimes to make people better able to be able to accommodate, to limit exposures. So, for people to realize it's going to be hot, don't go out and limit your exposures. So we need to, as a society, need to make sure that there are work and rest schedules so that people are not forced to go out and do that. We don't expect people to go out. In Australia, we have things like, for the construction industry, we have rain delays built into the contract. We don't have heat clauses in contracts, so that if someone's trying to build a house and they're contracted to finish doing this in 6 weeks or whatever, there's no clause saying, well, it was so hot I couldn't send my workers out there. We need to think about that nowadays because we know it's going to be hot. And so these are part of the ways that we need to sort of readjust for an increasingly hot world. So there's OC health and safety guidelines and making sure that people do adhere and can comply. And of course, if people are not going to get paid, then they will keep working. And so you need to be able to accommodate that so that people aren't necessarily out of pocket, because if people will be motivated to take risks if they have no option. It's like with COVID, if they weren't going to be paid, they'd have to go to work because they can't eat, they can't pay their rent. Even if they don't feel well, they will go to work because they weren't getting any money. And that's what's happened overseas. Community attitude and awareness. People really do need to acknowledge all the risks that are coming from climate change, and need to be better informed in terms of how they prevent it. And that's, you know, in one, you know, short hour, I don't have anywhere near the amount of time to actually go into the details. But with temperature, it's cooling strategies and first aid skills, and a layering of skills. Hydration is particularly important in terms of protecting people against heat, because you will succumb to the heat much more assuredly if people are dehydrated. Some up in the mines, up in northwest Australia, they've brought in tests of testing urine colour. And if you start work dehydrated, you're off the job, because they're not going to have people keeling over in the heat. And that's, you know, that's a very simple test. We can do it as we do in hospitals, as in test the specific gravity, but just testing the urine colour is a very easy way of testing that people are adequately hydrated. So, I mean, so with this, we need health education. With the cooling strategies, you know, people need to know what to do and how to apply effective cooling. First aid skills, again, we need health awareness, and it needs to be general. Everyone needs to know some baseline, but we also need to make sure that everybody on site has some specialist knowledge, so that you can tell whether this is a medical emergency or just they need to sit down and just rest and cool up for a bit. And we're going to need more and more of this. I think we should actually start building some of this into primary schools. And certainly there's certainly a market out there for those sort of entrepreneurial, in terms of, you know, skilling themselves up to be able to provide the in-depth and tailored information to workplaces, to governments, schools. It's a, you know, it's very much, it'll be a growing area of a growing industry. And of course, to stop people becoming dehydrated, then they have to be able to access water really easily, really cheaply, really quickly, and it has to be on site. And you also have to facilitate and allow people to stop and to drink. So if you're doing a sporting thing, make sure that the fluids, there's more breaks so that people can drink more, etc. So again, I'm just going to whiz through these last ones very quickly. So it's knowledge needs. People need to know exactly what's going to affect their local area. They need to understand the specifics. What can be expected? How likely is it? How soon? Who's going to be, you know, most at risk here? What are the specifics? And what is making them vulnerable? Because the aim is to develop adaptive strategies, and there'll be a range of options for different scenarios. That these need trialing and testing, and then checking to see what's working best. We'd argue that all of the community needs to be informed, because sometimes the services, like as happened in the fires, no one can get through. The roads are down, communications are down. People need to know how to look after themselves. The health system needs to be prepared. You know, and again, gets back to education and awareness raisings. You know, we need surveillance systems, so we've got all this sort of information. And the emergency planning and preparation and the training. Obviously, this all needs to get into the curricula for the new lot, but we also need to have training modules for all those who are currently in the workforce, because it wasn't a big issue when, you know, I've got grey hair. This wasn't an issue when I did my training way back then. Recognising that recovery phase is long and prevention is much, much cheaper. So just quickly, and I know we're running out of time here, so what I'm going to do is just quickly have these. I'll make the slides available so that you'll be able to read them up. But we talk in terms of the PPR, which is preparedness, prevention, response, and recovery. And you can go through those, but they're all really straightforward. I had wanted to go through some of the wet bulb globe temperature, but I think we're running out of time. This is a simple record for testing felt heat. So you can get it in a chart like this, with the temperature above the at the top here, along the x-axis, and the relative humidity. And so the wet bulb globe temperature, which is the WBGT, so that if the temperature was 25, the humidity was 40, you'd get a WBGT of 23, or if humidity was 70, you'd get 27. What does this mean? Again, I'll let you look at this after the thing. There's a variety of scales. The International Athletics Association has a set of guidelines at what temperature, it's a traffic light, what temperature you stop or curtail. The US Army, they're much more sturdy. They're willing to push their people a lot more. This is military versus volunteer athletes, of course, as to what WBGT you actually have to start pulling out and cancelling things. So we had that one of that. And they say that, you know, even on a day that's not too hot at 25, you'd have to start cautioning if your humidity was 70, and cancel if the humidity was tropical. As you get up to days, and we're seeing lots of days at 31, with the humidity, these caution and cancel temperatures start coming back. We get to 35, and the toleration of humidity diminishes down to about 15% before you start thinking, should we continue to do this? Once you get up to the 40s and 42s, if it's any humidity at all, and you know, Perth will be much like Melbourne, my hometown, our very hot days were always dry, but still it's very, very hot, and people need to not put themselves at risk. And I'll just finish this with, I'm terribly disappointed that Safe Work Australia does not include heat in some of their safe work guidelines. So this is a current one for their construction industry. They're thinking in terms of falls and machinery, but not heat. So I'm arguing that we really do need to factor in heat and what people are doing in terms of floods and the problems with droughts and the problems with, you know, storms, and how people are going to survive them. And we need to think about them more holistically and very much outside the box. So I'll close up now, but there's lots of heat plan resources that are available. And I've just listed here some references and resources to go, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Liz. That was very thorough and extensive, and honestly, it never gets easier to hear, does it? It's such a, it's so concerning, but it was an absolutely fabulous presentation. And I have had a couple of questions come through. I have had a couple of questions from Lauren. She has to shoot off in a second, so I'll ask those ones first. So Lauren Fortington has asked, we've recently compared sport and active employment roles to see the influence of motivation on extreme heat days. This was based on the idea that we often can't get enough people to stop sport despite extreme heat. There were several deaths in unorganised sport, such as outdoor hiking, and in uncertain employment situations, such as cash in hand and off the books, more than those in a regulated type of job role. Of course, these cases were in our favourite injury group, young adult males. How can we get the message to sink in that heat can kill?
I'm just trying to find where this is written in the
chat function.
Was this the one from Lauren Fortington?
Yeah, that's correct.
Recently compared, and I'm just going down to the question because initially I couldn't hear you very well. Oh, how can we get the message to sink in? Yeah. I would say that in public health, what we tend to do is a variety of strategies, because people absorb health messages differently. Some, it's like if you think of it about how we got people to stop smoking, just saying that smoking is bad for you, it can kill you, don't smoke, it'll stop some, but not very many. So you need multiple messages in multiple different formats. You need to bring in the champions, like sporting heroes and, you know, celebrities or whatever people are, interested in listening to, so that you can appeal to, the young and the hip and the groovy and the kiddies and the old people and the, the tradies and the, all the different sectors of society, because people absorb messages if it comes from someone that they respond to. And sadly, we have to realize that scientific data just doesn't do it for so many people. But however, scientific data coming from trusted people like, your healthcare providers, if people listen to the you know, the proper experts as compared to, you know, Trump and others, then that's a strong messaging. So you try lots of different messaging and you repeat it. And so that gradually what happens is that more and more people start getting the message, and eventually they suddenly realize that they're an outlier. You know, they're the ones that are holding up and not, you know, they're the last one holding on to that. Another thing we do, of course, is show them examples. And so, again, this is part of the advertising that can happen through the health departments. And as they were doing with COVID, you will have seen ads that even young people, you know, they were pushing that it's not just the oldies. So they showed interviews with young people who, you know, I got COVID and I got it again and I can't breathe and it's really problematic, so that the young people would cotton on to that idea. So it's very diverse messaging. And you just need to ram it home. And this is a major role for health departments and, you know, that have the budgets, because basically we know that prevention is so much better than cure. And it's always a tragic loss. And we'd argue that any heat death is an unnecessary death. And so, you know, it's a tragic loss of life and, you know, not only for the person, but everyone who loved and cared for them.
Great, thank you.
I'll just add one more thing, is that, and this is the thing that I really found in my heat research project, is that even the people who are working in the heat, they overestimated their capacity. So again, this was what I was trying to get extra money for from the NH and MRC to really home at home. The older people, they were a bit more aware because they'd seen it before. The youngsters still thought they were impervious. And they thought they could, you know, keep working at 30 degrees. And they started showing, when I went out to test, they started showing symptoms at a much lower temperature. And so that was something that, of course, because I had climate change in it, my research proposal didn't get up, which is a bit of a pity. But we need to keep fighting because Australians, particularly, you know, the blokey sort of tradie world, tend to think, you know, don't be a girl. And so we have to diffuse that notion that being heat conscious is not being girly, you know, it's not being weak, you know, it's not, you know, there's nothing tough about risking your life.
Right. Liz, I have the second question from Lauren as well. In the ICD, exertional heat deaths are coded as T67 in the injury chapter. We recently looked at cases in Victoria that were emergency department treated or admitted in hospital, but there is a real challenge with case identification. Symptoms, signs are non-specific, nausea, headache, and if not coded correctly, we have little way to capture them. Liz, can you comment on how recording of cases can be improved so that we can better track them over time and understand their occurrence in different activities? We need this underpinning evidence for our research, but it is apparently not exciting to look at coding on heat injury cases.
Yeah, that's a fabulous question, and one that we've been fighting and battling for a long time, but we think we might be beginning to make some headway because we've got the College of Physicians involved in this one as well. That's been led by a colleague here at ANU, a cardiologist who's gone into the climate change realm, because the problem has always been that heat is not if you have a look at the data, only about 2-3 people die of heat a year, and that's because it's not recorded as a heat death. Because what physiologically, and didn't have time to go into any of that in this talk, sorry I ran over, is that heat exposure puts great strain on the heart, because the heart is trying to it's trying to maintain a blood pressure while all your vessels are dilated, so that you've got all your blood flow close to the skin, so you can lose the heat. And of course, when it's hot, it's not working. And your heart's really trying. So it's opened everything up, so your blood pressure falls, so your heart's going really, really hard trying to maintain a blood pressure. So if you've got a heart problem at all, or you're old or obese, or any of the other sort of things, or on certain medications, your heart is not going to be able to meet the level of demand. So they're recorded as a heart death. If people are very dehydrated and you get acute renal failure, because the kidneys are trying to conserve, because you're dehydrated, they're trying to conserve all the fluid you've got, and you end up with acute renal failure. So that's recorded as a kidney death. So what we're trying to do is get heat into the, you know, what happens in terms of the, you know, when people come in, it's the with the medical records, and so that will be sort of parts on the form. Otherwise, it's a matter for researchers to try to align the number of deaths on a day versus what the temperature was on that day, which is how we've tried to do it. The best way to get it is, and whoever wrote this is probably aware of the 2009 study that was put out by Victoria's or Melbourne's Chief Health Officer, because in hospitals, what we do is every night, we send through all the hospital data as the hospital census. That raw data goes to the health department. They've got it at midnight, instantly, every night. So they can actually have a look at how many extra deaths. And this is why we talk in terms of extra deaths rather than, you know, Fred Daggs and, you know, Mary Marmaduke, because we know that we'd normally get, you know, 50 deaths a day. We get a hot temperature and we get 100 deaths. And we know that these deaths are in excess, and that's why we talk in terms of excess deaths. If we do get those coded properly, then we'd be able to get real-time data. So it's a very important thing, because without the data, you can't go to the policymakers and say, look at all this. You know, we need to expend money because we're losing these lives. And it gets back to the fact you always need the data to provide evidence to get the funding to do what you need to do. That's the way it is.
Great, thank you, Liz. It doesn't look like we have any more questions coming through. So I will, I'm just going to share my screen and finish up the presentation. Great, there we go. So yeah, once again, the biggest thanks, Liz. That presentation was really great. There's a lot of information in there for us to process. So thank you for taking the time to share your knowledge with us. So just looking at a few next steps following on today's presentations. No Injury has a range of different resources available on the website that can support people in some of their injury prevention activities. So we have a range of different fact sheets on injury issues such as burns and scalds or drowning, poisoning. So I encourage you to jump on and take a look. We also have regional resource kits for all of the different health regions such as wheat belts, Great Southern, Southwest. And we also have campaign toolkits as well, such as the snakebite toolkit there. So I know we do also have quite a few local governments attending today. So we do have the Guide to Promoting Safety and Preventing Injury for Local Governments, which can support you in strategic planning to address some of these local health, community health needs through the prevention of injury and promotion of safety. So we have quite a few upcoming training and events which might be of interest to some of the people attending today. So I encourage you to jump on the No Injury website or Injury Matters website and register for some of these trainings. I'll send out some links as well in follow-up emails for those events you would like to go to. So to keep the conversation from today going, just a few different opportunities that Injury Matters provides. We do have an injury prevention network that meets quarterly to provide practitioners such as yourself from across Western Australia with an opportunity to connect with each other and to share your learnings and solutions in injury prevention, community safety and recovery. We also have our Get Connected program, which provides you with the opportunity to build your professional network and to keep you engaged in today's conversation. Connected is a networking program whereby you are randomly paired bi-monthly to have a 15-minute conversation with another professional working in the injury prevention space. And just a reminder as well that we do have that evaluation that will pop up, a survey will pop up when the webinar finishes. So please take a few minutes to provide some feedback. It's your feedback just helps ensure that we're delivering training that's relevant for your needs. So an exciting project from Injury Matters is the 2021 Injury Matters Injury Prevention and Safety Promotion Awards. So applications are now open. The awards recognise individuals and organisations who are having a positive impact on the community by conducting activities that aim to prevent and reduce the impact of injury within WA. So the awards are open until the 11th of December, and we're encouraging applications from the diverse injury prevention and safety promotion sector. So this can include non-for-profit groups, private sector, community groups, educational institution and government bodies. So I'll send around some more information and the award categories in the follow-up email, but I encourage all of you to jump on to the Injury Matters website and take a look and put an application in there as well to showcase some of the exciting work that's happening across WA in the space. So that is all for today. So yeah, once again, thank you to everyone for tuning in, and hopefully you were able to get a few good take homes away to, I guess, look at what you can be doing in the short and long term to help reduce the impacts of climate change on your community. And once again, the biggest thanks to Liz for sharing your huge amount of knowledge in a space with us today. And I know you've got a lot of links in there and quite a bit of information. So we'll share those, make those slides available to participants as well. So thank you, everyone. And yeah, thank you for attending today.